These are the people who decide elections. We have spent too much time in the media talking about the richest 10 electorates in the country.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the 87 in the dead middle that can and will decide every single time.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the challenge for Peter Dutton is going to be that Anthony Albanese has, he's an authentic person. He is what he is what you see, and he can connect with that part of Australia. He's not pretending to be something that he's not. He's got a lot of common sense about him. People know his life story now, and so I think that's going to be pretty hard for Peter Dutton to get over first-term opposition. But, I mean, I think there's a bigger challenge there for Peter Dutton. I mean, there's a lot of analysis of what happened in the election, but I think we can all agree that it was a clear repudiation of the politics of the hard right. And Peter Dutton's problem is that he's been the number one spear carrier for the hard right. We saw that in the final days of the election campaign with what I thought was a pretty shameful politicising of those 15 people arriving from Sri Lanka on a boat. So he needs a complete reset around his politics. Now, I'm not saying it's not impossible. The truth is he's been a police officer, he's a family man, so he needs to sort of hit the reset button, be Superintendent Sensible, play a constructive role as opposition leader, and quickly move on some of those policies which really dog the Liberals. He needs to say he's going to support a corruption body. He needs to say they got it wrong around women and the whole Brittany Higgins mess, and he needs to move on climate change as well. If he can do all that, he'll be in with a chance.
Okay, so Nicholas, interesting point you say about climate change, right? Which is, there were about 1.1 million people who ended up voting for One Nation and Palmer. Their views are net zero, must die, go away, right? There were 4.7 million people who voted for the Liberal Party who said, no, we don't want legislated 43%. Now, there were 4.2 million people who voted for Labor, 1.5 million who voted for the Greens, and 1.3 who voted somewhere else. So I'm thinking it's kind of 50-50 here. Bill Shorten went into the Parliament after the 2013 election and said, I have a mandate not to dismantle the carbon tax. Doesn't Peter Dutton have a mandate not to support 43% via legislation? He wouldn't step in and stop it, but to turn around and say he has to support it. Does he have to do that?
Well, firstly, the minor parties on the right, including United Australia Party, which threw $100 million at the election campaign and didn't win a single seat. I don't know that you can really characterise that vote as neatly as you just did as being a pro-coal part of the electorate. I think there's a complex series of factors that were going on there, but ultimately it boiled down to a rejection of the major parties. In terms of what Labor did after the 2013 election, I mean, look, Labor went through its own period of difficulty there about what to do about the carbon tax, but ultimately they came to the view that the people had rejected that, and so they walked away from that policy. And as painful it will be for the Liberal Party, I think they've got to go on a similar journey. I don't expect it to happen next week. It'll probably take a couple of months, but they need to embrace real action on climate change, the way other Conservative parties around the world have. Let's not forget, in Britain, Boris Johnson has committed to 78% cut in emissions by 2035. That's double the cuts that Labor just took to this election.
Hang on a minute.
Hang on. Beyond this issue as being
Nicholas,
Liberal and Labor. And
Nicholas, if you're going to start using the Boris Johnsons and maybe Europe as an example, why aren't we, with the other 19 nations attached to the G20, discussing in this next 3 years the idea of modular nuclear reactors?
100%.
Because the 19 G20 countries, apart from Australia, are, but we can't grow up. We're not grown up enough. You've got Finland's Green Party, who've even ticked off on it. Surely our Greens can one day grow up and also discuss this and talk about it. I reckon this is the answer for Peter Dutton.
I agree.
Forget about going one way or the other way on emissions targets. Say to the people, I want a discussion right now about modular reactors and sell it like crazy, which we know he can do. And maybe this is not something the public can buy in the next 2.5 years, but they'll get there in 5 years' time.
Yeah, I mean, I also think, Nicholas, before I get your response on it, can we play what Peter Dutton had to say today about emissions? This is what the new Liberal leader said.
In terms of policy on climate, I'm a very passionate believer in making sure that we have the appropriate response to the issue of our emissions reductions. We need to do it in a sensible way. Out in the suburbs, out in the regional communities, people are putting $20 and $40 of fuel in their car at the moment because they can't afford to fill it up. And similarly with their electricity bills. We'll support policies which aren't going to turn lights off in small businesses, aren't going to send families broke in the suburbs because they can't afford Labor's power bill.
So, Nick, I do think that nuclear power is something that can be the new baseload. I read a bizarre editorial in the Herald today that said all renewables and only renewables. Well, okay, feel free to tell us about the backup storage, the nighttime capacity, all of these things. Do they know something at the Herald office that we don't in the rest of the world? But I think that this is a constructive part of the conversation. This is about saying this is our solution. This is our technology solution as opposed to a price disincentive of which the Australian people can accept or reject. But I think that can be an offering about emissions reduction, can't it?
So I agree with Chris's analysis about those European economies. Nuclear is part of the mix in Europe. And so that's been an important part of them being able to move rapidly towards zero net emissions much faster than other countries like Australia. I also want to put on the record that I don't have an ideological issue with nuclear either. And the reason why we haven't had that source of power in Australia to date boils down to two things. One is the politics, but second, it's just not economic. There's been much cheaper sources of power available. The problem I can see the right of Australian politics getting itself into now, though, is you're trying to set up nuclear power as some sort of point of differentiation, and you're trying to work up, Peter Dutton so he can prove that he's a hairy-chested Conservative because he's putting nuclear in there. Now, the problem with that is that other technologies are coming along and advancing at a rapid rate of knots, and it could well be that batteries do provide a technological solution. If they do,
but they don't know.
Have to get around the thorny question of where you're going to relocate the nuclear power plant.
You don't have to guess about this technology.
That's got to be a better solution.
But Nicholas, you don't have to guess about this technology. You're guessing about backup battery power and making sure that renewable power can be stored. We don't have any certainty of that, but we've got nuclear power which is proven. And as I say again, this is something that you can tell the Greens you're getting your CO2 emissions 100%. You can tell the Conservative Party that we're going to keep the lights on. Sorry, your Conservative voters, we're going to keep the lights on. At least have the conversation. Get rid of this silly law where we can't even use it for power, so it opens up. And I know Albo won't use it because he's so anti-nuclear, it's not funny, but we should be talking about it.
But okay, but Nick, here's my thing, right? Hang on, mate. About the national conversation about nuclear, right? I think the only way this is ever going to happen is obviously the government has to build it. But imagine if the trade-off was to whatever the city, whatever the regional centre was that had it, you can have free power for 30 years.
Yeah.
That's how it's not about, this giant, big, scary thing and everyone, mate. My knowledge of regional Australia, nobody wants it literally in their backyard, but if you can have free power for 30 years, you're more than happy to have it a few k's down the road. Now, quickly before we go, Nicholas, as I've said to you...
Hang on, Paul, just before next time we get together, next time we get together, we're going to put a map up of Australia, and you and Chris are going to show me the electorates in Australia which you think should have nuclear power or should be open to it. And we'll colour them on the map, and we'll take a screenshot.
See, that's the game.
Okay. Well, the offer is, if you want it, that you think should get it.
No. See, I get the scare campaign, right? But my point is that the deal is this would be built, this will be paid for, hands up who wants it. I don't think there's going to be 151 hands down. I think there may be one or two that might end up putting their hands up. Look, I'm way out of time. Nicholas, I love you so much. Thank you for being the bigger man. I was a bit nasty behind the scenes and didn't mean to be, but I appreciate you being the bigger man and rejoining us on the show. Thank you, mate.
Good to be here.
Good man. Nicholas Reece, none other than Chris Smith, and we've got plenty more to fire up about here on Paul Murray Live.